Hey everyone, welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases. And it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. Today, I've got a special guest, and this podcast episode is going to be presented on both the Inflammation Nation and the Funk Med Nation podcasts, simply because there's going to be information here for general healthcare consumers as well as functional medicine practitioners. Today, we're going to be talking about predictive genetic testing. And my guest, who will be on here shortly, is Dahlia Attia-King. And she is the founder and CEO of Panacea. That's a genetic testing company. She's got a BS in biology and chemistry from the University of Miami. And she's got experience working for genetic laboratories, which exposed her to the reality that very few people were able to access valuable preventive genetic testing. And she learned very quickly that the lack of insurance coverage for genetic testing and thus physician hesitancy to order testing were some of the most inhibitory barriers. She then had an additional 6 years in healthcare technology, and that's where she learned about the innovative solutions that could push healthcare into a much-needed era of modernization. And after embarking on a multi-year journey to further unravel the complex reasons for genetic testing underutilization, she met Dr. Hinko Gehrman, and they were inspired to create a solution, which is Panacea. So Panacea was founded with a mission to reduce barriers to access, I should say, clinical genetic testing so that people can get in control of their health and prevent disease, which is completely in line with my thought process. Panacea now offers residents of almost every state in the U.S. the ability to receive at-home clinical genetic testing called whole exome sequencing. We'll be talking about what that means, and also access to expert medical guidance in just a few clicks, empowering people to potentially save their own lives. And with that introduction, here's my conversation with Dahlia Attia-King. All right, so I sent you those questions.
Yeah.
When I put those questions, I'm really coming at it from the perspective, I have my own questions that I would like answers to, if you can answer them.
Yeah.
And I also tried to put myself in the position of, say, either in our case with this conversation, because I'm going to post this on both of my podcasts, I try to sit in the position of a healthcare consumer who knows that they can get genetic testing done, and also a healthcare practitioner. And most of the people that listen to the podcast, I mean, it's called Funk Med Nation. So most of us are functional or integrative medicine practitioners, and that could be a medical doctor, chiropractor, acupuncturist, whatever.
Love it.
And I don't know, I guess we're just going to roll into the conversation, right? So good thing we're recording. But I don't know if you're aware that in our space, I'm sure you are, but in our space of natural medicine, there are a lot of companies that are marketing to providers like myself that say, hey, we can do genetic testing and, give you the optimized nutritional supplement protocol and tell you what kind of exercise you should do and the kind that you should stay away from and all this kind of stuff. Why don't we save that question or that topic for a little bit later? What I would like to do is start from the very big picture and then kind of winnow down to some of the more details, and obviously eventually get to the work that you're doing with Panacea.
Sure.
And the story about how that came about. So why don't we let's start with the healthcare consumer in mind.
Sure.
And
so
go ahead. Just start talking.
Before we really get into it, you sent some really awesome topics here. I just got an opportunity to quickly glance at them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'll be able to answer every single one of these questions in depth. I mean, this is incredibly thorough. You certainly did your job in digging deep in here. So there might be some things I won't be able to really dive into, but
Yeah. And that's totally fine.
go ahead and ask your questions. And of course, if there's something I can't really dive into either because I don't fully have a good knowledge base about it or
Yep.
whatever, we can.
Yeah,
we can
this is like of many topics that we could talk about in the field of natural medicine. When you start talking about genes and genetic testing, I mean, it's perhaps on the more complicated side, right?
Right. It is absolutely. It's dense and it's boring and it's not always very clear either, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't really know. We know very little about genetics actually and how they play a role in our health. But anyway, so we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
I wanted to also ask you a question and I totally forgot.
That's all right. It'll come back to you. So why don't we start with that concept? Like, we don't have it all figured out yet. I get the sense that a lot of healthcare consumers and certainly doctors, and I know this because I talk to hundreds of doctors every year in seminars that I teach, and it's almost like there's this perception that genetic testing is quote unquote settled science, that with the completion of the Human Genome Project 20 or so years ago, that we have genes totally figured out. And like, how would you have a conversation with somebody who has that belief and help them to understand things that maybe is based a little bit more in reality?
It's a good point and it's a good perspective. I think we really have barely scratched the surface when it comes to understanding genetics and how they play a role in our health. We've certainly learned a lot, right? And science is never actually settled, right? Science is constantly changing and we're constantly growing our knowledge base and building our knowledge base. The good news is that I think when it comes to genetics, there's a few things we understand. And those things, fortunately, we sort of understand pretty well, right? Pretty confidently. There's a handful of genes that play a role in specific diseases like certain cancers, certain cardiovascular conditions, and certain neurological disorders like Alzheimer's. And when a patient gets a genetic test and they may have a known mutation in one of those genes, we kind of have a good grasp on what can potentially be done for this patient to reduce their risk of developing these problems. If you're doing genetic testing for prevention, which frankly is the most powerful way to use genetic testing.
Right.
Is to sort of do it before an individual develops a problem, before they are sick, so that you can hopefully reduce their opportunity of becoming sick, or in some cases, eliminate it completely. When you're using genetic testing for an individual that is already sick, for example, an individual that might have a specific type of cancer, the power of understanding the genetic makeup of that particular individual is it can help identify what therapies will work to treat the disease that patient is experiencing. So in those cases, in those areas where we have a pretty deep and wide knowledge of genetics and an understanding of what they're doing, genetic testing can be really, really powerful because we sort of have a grasp on what's going on there. There's still so many areas, as you said, where we don't know what genes are doing and how they're playing a role in our health or in our disease susceptibility. And that area is constantly growing. And the more data we have and the more people that get tested and the more people that are willing to share their de-identified data, the more we will begin to understand what exactly our genes are doing and how we can use them to kind of keep us healthy.
Yeah. And so I think just in that little monologue there, you identified several different roles that genetic testing can play, right? One is the predictive part, which I hope we get a chance to talk more about. The other is the diagnostic. And that could be identifying existing disease conditions, or, as you mentioned, testing for either successful therapeutics, which may include pharmacogenomics, right? How you
Mm-hmm.
respond to different drugs. Um,
Mm-hmm.
does the kind of testing that you're doing, and maybe this question is a little bit outside of the entity of Panacea and the work that you're doing, and just in the realm of genomic testing in general. What about susceptibility testing? For example, if you have estrogen responsive tumors or something else, like, do you guys get into not just testing human genomics, but testing the disease entity itself, if that's even the right way to phrase that?
Yeah, so we mostly focus our core focus as of today, right? We always can expand, and we have,
Future
of
can
course,
change.
ideas for a future. Exactly.
Yeah.
Today, our core focus is on preventative genetic testing, in order to help identify what your inherited disease susceptibility looks like, right? So you inherited genes from mom and dad at the point of your conception, and those particular gene combinations are what we're looking at. We want to know what your risk for developing certain things, like I said, different types of cancers and neurological disorders, and all kinds of cardiovascular conditions and what have you, right? We want to know what the risk for you really is over your lifetime because of the gene combination that you inherited. This doesn't include the effects of your environment on your genes. It doesn't affect, the effects of your lifestyle on your genes. This is solely your inherited risk. Basically, the risk that sort of are just dealt, right? These risks are nothing that you could have changed, nothing that your parents could have changed. It's just the cards that you were dealt, right? The good news is that when you understand where your risks are, when you can see the cards that you've been dealt, you can work with your healthcare provider in order to create a specific targeted healthcare plan so that you can address those very specific risks and reduce the likelihood of you developing a problem. It's almost like, a little crystal ball, right? Where you can look in and you can see, this could be my future, and these are the cards I've been dealt, and this is what I can do in order to, sort of get a hold of my future, right?
Yeah.
So that's really the power of preventative genetic testing when you focus on your hereditary disease risks.
Do you think that we have a solid handle on what percentage of total or real risk someone's genetic profile presents for the more common things like cancers and heart disease?
Yeah, I think that area is certainly still quite nascent, and still needs a lot of growth and development. And again, the more data we have, and the more research we do, the more we understand these things. But it still needs a lot of work. But there are a lot of areas, like I said, where we're pretty confident because we have plenty of data to support those areas. For example, I'm sure people have heard of the BRCA gene, right? BRCA1 and BRCA2. The BRCA genes are really well researched, and there's a lot of data to support the percentage of elevated risk that an individual may have if they have a specific mutation, right, in the BRCA gene, in the BRCA1 gene or BRCA2 gene. And so if you are an individual that has a mutation in the BRCA gene, the percentage is pretty confident, right? We know that specific mutations can make somebody 80% more likely to develop breast cancer, in some cases ovarian cancer, right? And so those specific, very well-studied genes allow us to kind of offer these pretty solid percentage risk percentages. There are some other genes that are also well researched, but maybe not as well researched, and so we don't really fully have a solid understanding of what the genetic predisposition might particularly yield for a patient. But again, more data and more studies go into this all the time. And with things like genetic testing, there's also a lot of AI that's being introduced in order to correctly analyze and offer better predictions of what a particular mutation might offer, and what different mutations collectively, right, pulled together might also yield for
yeah, patients. And that's exactly what I was thinking as you were talking, is that and obviously the more variables you put into some kind of an equation, the more complicated or the more difficult it is to end up with results in some kind of a study that you're really confident in. And so I don't know that science is at the point where it can look at the sum total of all your genetic variations and come up with some kind of an aggregate, or identify, like, sure, you have a BRCA gene, but you also have a variant over here that is actually quite beneficial that negates some of the risk from the BRCA1 or 2 gene. And that raises another issue that I think that I think most healthcare consumers are not aware, is that some genetic variants, and I'm not saying the ones that you guys focus on with the work at Panacea, but some genetic variants actually confer benefit. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when you start factoring in, well, when you isolate a particular gene and say, okay, I'll use the BRCA just because you brought that up, that might in some people confer an increased risk of breast cancer by 80%, but is that mitigated by other things? And I don't know that we have answers to that. Like,
sure.
I think collectively we're smart enough to ask the question, but I don't think we're smart enough yet to actually have the answer.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I don't think we have the answer yet. But I think, just like you said, we sort of have this knowledge and this awareness that some genes are actually conferring some protection, right? And we actually, I think, see that even in Alzheimer's today. I think the APOE4 is the mutation, I believe, and don't quote me on this because I'm not a geneticist. But that particular gene increases your risk, right, for developing Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it is the APOE4 gene, yes.
APOE4. And then there's, I think, the APOE2 and then 3, and I think one of those actually confers protection. Yeah. So, in that very specific example we have, depending on your mutation, you could either have an elevated risk or a lower risk, right?
Yeah.
And certainly that exists in many other cases as well, many other genes and many other mutations. We're still figuring it out, right? We're still learning every day these specific gene behaviors and how these behaviors are directly affecting our health and how in combination they're affecting our health. But like I said, I think the good news is that although there's still much to learn, what we do know, we know pretty well. We're pretty confident about these things. And that's why genetic testing, especially clinical genetic testing for prevention, is such a powerful tool, because it can help us understand what a particular what kind of risk a particular individual might be carrying in those handful. And when I say handful, I'm talking about thousands of genes. I'm not talking about 5 or 6 genes. We're talking about thousands of genes. And when we review those thousands of genes, and those are the genes that we're pretty confident about, because there's a lot of data there to support how those genes behave in our health, we can really have a great opportunity to help people get ahead of these risk factors and stay healthy.
Yeah, and so that brings up, and it's almost become a catchphrase in science and certainly in natural medicine, is that you even said this in some of the emails that we sent back and forth, that genes are not your destiny. And yet, I still hear people all the time saying, well, I've got XYZ problem. Well, my dad had it, my mom had it, my grandmother had it, so it's genetic. And it's like they're throwing their hands up in defeat and just, betraying this mindset that, well, it's genetic, I can't do anything about it. So one of the things that I like about, I'll say the little that I know about Panacea, is that you are not just trying to provide individuals and clinicians with predictive data. You're trying to bridge the gap between that and taking action, which in and of itself says that you guys understand that genes are not your destiny. So you have someone's genetic profile, and then you have all of these other epigenetic factors or influences that can either, tune up or tune down the probability that something will actually manifest in someone's life. So instead of me going off on a monologue, why don't you talk about that from your perspective, from Panacea's perspective? Why did you take that extra step and say, hey, we're not just going to be a gene testing service. We're going to try to connect people to, I think the term you guys use are genetic counselors, and I might be wrong on that. So
no, that's right.
Yeah. So why did you say, well, we need to put this piece in there? What problem were you trying to solve by going beyond the simple testing?
Yeah. So let me just quickly explain a little bit about Panacea and what we do so your audience can fully understand.
Yeah.
We are actually not a lab. We are not a group of genetic counselors. We are not a group of doctors. We are none of that. What we do is we actually bring these vital key stakeholders together in one simple workflow so that anybody and everybody that wants to access life-saving clinical genetic testing can do so right on our site without actually having to go to your doctor, beg them, convince them that you need this test, which 99% of the time they're going to tell you you don't need it, because doctors are not always fully trained on how to utilize genetic testing in the care of their patients. And this science changes so quickly, doctors can barely keep up with it. In addition, insurance companies don't always cover genetic testing for people, even when it is indicated that you might benefit from genetic testing.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to access in traditional healthcare today. So what we did is we pooled together all of the stakeholders that have to be together for the effective delivery of clinical genetic testing. What most people don't understand is that clinical genetic testing, or really any kind of genetic testing that gives you information about your health, is not always very easy to understand. Sometimes it's not easy to understand what it means, and a lot of times it's not even easy to understand what it doesn't mean. That is just as important as what it does mean. And the renowned expert on clinical genetic testing is a genetic counselor. It's actually not a doctor, not a physician, not a general physician, at least. So what we decided to do is number one, we're going to deliver real clinical genetic testing to people, because that is the type of genetic testing that you should be basing your healthcare decisions on, not direct to consumer, genetic testing. And we can explain the difference between that. So number one, we're going to do that. We're going to make life-changing, life-saving clinical genetic testing accessible, like, buying dog food on Amazon is. Super easy, super simple, and accessible and affordable, by the way. That's a whole other factor. These tests aren't always affordable. Number two, we're going to deliver this information with the right clinical guidance. And that includes the guidance of a genetic counselor. The genetic counselors sit with the patients for an hour right after patients get their results. And the genetic counselor is going to review and analyze your test results and give you an idea of what they mean, and again, what they don't mean, and what you can be doing about your particular genetic makeup. Are there certain screenings that can be done more frequently for somebody like you with your genetic makeup? Are there certain medications that you can be on? Are there certain lifestyle changes that you can essentially make to help reduce your risks? There are so many things that are actually in the control of the patient, in our control, right? My control, your control. Even if it is something that we carry in our genes, we still have control most people, I think, forget that your health is 50% maybe your genes and 50% your environment, your lifestyle, what you're exposed to on a daily basis, etc. And so there's a good chunk of your health that is actually in your hands. And the other issue is that when you do have a genetic mutation for something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to develop a problem or you're going to get a disease. It's just a red flag. It's just saying, hey, this particular combination that you inherited from mom and dad makes you a little bit more at risk for this problem. And so it's kind of like a, hey, pay attention to me type of thing. It is not written in stone. It is not something that, is unchangeable and you just have to throw your hands up in the air and surrender to. So again, that's why these tests are so powerful, because there are so many things that you can be done, or so many things that can be done, so many things that you can do that are in your control to kind of reduce that inherited risk that you got from mom and dad.
Hey guys, Dr. N here. I wanted to step in for just a moment to tell you about a discount code that Dahlia and her team have graciously offered my listeners that gives you 20% off the genetic testing that we're talking about in this episode. As you know, and you've heard me say this before, everything about your health is determined by how your diet and lifestyle choices and your environmental exposures affect your genetic predispositions. And while as a general rule, I don't advocate for direct-to-consumer gene testing from a let's throw everything at the wall and see what sticks perspective, I do think that the type of testing Panacea offers holds great value. Given that heart disease and cancer are the top two thieves of not just quality of life, but life itself, maybe, just maybe, knowing you do or don't have genes that greatly increase your risk of these things can just be the trigger that you need to take care of your health and to take it more seriously. Having said that, you can head on over to seekpanacea.com. The link is in the description, and use the discount code Dr. Noseworthy 20 to get 20% off their genetic testing, which includes a consultation with a qualified genetic counselor. Now back to the show. So the role of the genetic counselor then, in terms of the lifestyle implications, do they just raise the awareness, or do they actually deliver action steps and programs and walk people through a process, or is their role mostly to say, this particular gene is affected by some quantity by how you live your life? Do you exercise? Do you not? Do you smoke? Do you not? Do you do whatever? So how far down that path do the genetic counselors that you're connected with, how far do they bring their clients?
Yeah. So today, obviously there's the session that sort of delivers the results and offers next steps. But the guidance is always that the patient takes the summary and the results directly to their healthcare provider, directly to their patient, to their physician, because the next steps, aside from the lifestyle, right, changes that could potentially be made, the next steps are really important for your healthcare provider to know, for your doctor to understand, because again, those may include extra screenings, they may include certain blood tests, they may, include certain medications, and that's why the genetic counselor will always advise that the handoff, or that the next step, is for the patient to take this information to their providers, because their clinical providers are key to keeping them healthy, right? This is not this. Our endeavor here at Panacea is never to eliminate the physicians. What we do is we make it easier for people to get this test outside of their physicians. However, it is very important for their physicians to play a role in their healthcare when these results come out and when the guidance is given by the genetic counselor.
Yeah, and I can only speak for myself, but I have a feeling that most other practitioners have. That's okay.
Sorry, my dog.
That's all right.
I'm watching my dog.
Most other practitioners probably have the same mindset that, sometimes we look for the trigger that's going to help people change how they look at, number one, their autonomy. I'll come back to that. And number two, how important it is for them to take the results seriously, right? And so on the autonomy side, I've always believed, and this is, to me, it's one of my core principles and core tenets, is that 80% of what people can do to get healthier is under their control. And most of that falls into the realms of changing their diet, looking at their lifestyle, which has multiple subcomponents, and, in our world, taking targeted nutritional supplements that are specific to them, rather than just some kind of generic stuff. So that's the autonomy part, is about taking ownership and saying, I'm not going to simply rely on the medical system or a given practitioner to tell me what to do. I'm going to take ownership of that. But sometimes I would imagine being confronted with, and that's a strong word, but being presented with a report that says you are genetically primed for X, Y, and Z, which can be affected by medications, lifestyle changes, et cetera. That's got to be pretty compelling, a compelling impetus for people to take it seriously and then to go to someone to get the help. Mm-hmm. But here's my question, and this is probably where we can branch off and talk about different types of testing and the way that other organizations have handled that and are handling that. Back to the idea of genetic testing is not settled science. It's also not 100% foolproof, right? That I don't think there's any testing methodology out there that is 100% sensitive and 100% specific, meaning that it never gets it wrong.
Right.
And that's also like, and that belief also, unfortunately, is present with clinicians. Like they think that if they do genetic testing, that it's an absolute, that if a company says you have XYZ gene variant, then that means you have it without any shadow of a doubt.
Right. So
when I emailed you, some thoughts on what we're going to talk about today, I made note of an article from the journal Nature, which I podcasted on this before. I posted on social media before. And let me this is not for your sake, it's just for everybody listening. But in 2018, the journal Nature did split testing with DNA samples, and they sent half of each sample to basically a gene research lab, I think it was. And the other half of the sample went to 23andMe. And yes, I'm going to name names.
You said it, not me.
I know. I'm allowed to. And so the results of the study, and I'll put the link to the study in the episode description so people can go see this for themselves. But basically, the 23andMe report, in comparison to, let's call it the gene reference lab, had a 40% false positive rate, meaning that, say, 40% of the things that 23andMe said this person had or these people had, they in fact did not.
Right.
On top of that, the study's authors concluded that the third-party gene databases that were available back in 2018, and I'm sure the quality of these databases have improved over the years, that they were either missing critical data or in some cases were frankly incorrect. Yet back in 2018, 2019, somewhere around that time, there was a lot of people that were jumping on this bandwagon of getting their genes tested for the purposes of understanding their health and sometimes directly driving lifestyle changes or even nutritional supplementation. And they had this mistaken thought that, again, the results were bulletproof.
Right.
So, and this may be getting into an area where you don't feel comfortable answering, and that's okay. But do you have a sense in general of what the error rate is? Even, and let's assume that Panacea is using the top tier technology, cutting edge technology. What's the error rate? Is it 0.5%? Is it 4%? Is it 40%? Like they saw with 23andMe back in 2018?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey guys, thanks for listening and being a loyal subscriber. Wanted to let you know about several important resources that you have available to you as listeners to the Inflammation Nation podcast. The first is my lab shop. The link is in the episode description, and this is a place where you can get access to the very same tests that I use in my clinical practice with all of my personal coaching clients. You don't need a prescription, and the system is set up so that my listeners can access quality labs at direct-to-lab pricing. The second resource is a list of learning courses that I offer for very reasonable prices through my main website. I have courses on gut health, detox, and several that are related to thyroid and Hashimoto's. If you're a true do-it-yourselfer, you need to check these out. They're consumer-friendly versions of the topics that I teach to doctors in my doctor-only functional medicine seminars. The link to the course list is also in the description. And finally, the third resource is me. Even though I'm involved in many different projects, I'm still accepting new clients. Having said that, I do limit the number of people I take on as clients every month so that I can give everyone the level of personal attention that they deserve. So if you have a health issue that you haven't been able to solve on your own or with your current provider team, you can use the link in the episode description or the contact form on my website to email me directly and let me know that you want to schedule an appointment. My initial consultation is an hour long, and it's designed to help me understand the scope and nature of your problems and to make sure that we're a good fit for each other. And finally, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and hit the notification bell so that you know when new episodes drop. Thanks for being a loyal listener. And now, back to the podcast.
Sure. I think of all the things that I would love for people to take away from this conversation, it's this particular question, this particular topic. So thank you for bringing it up. So I think the first thing that people really have to understand, and most people don't really have a good understanding of this, which is understandable, right? The stuff is complicated, and not everybody's an expert here. I'm not even an expert on the technical side, yeah. Right? The key thing to understand here is that most direct-to-consumer companies are using a very different type of technology than clinical laboratories. They're both doing genetic testing, but the genetic testing that each one is doing is different, and the technology that's being used is very different. Direct-to-consumer companies typically use a technology called microarray. And microarray, I compare it to a search and find function in a digital document. Let's say you want to find a word that you know you misspelled a few times in the document. You activate the search and find feature, you type in the misspelled word, and that misspelled word essentially gets highlighted every time it appears in the document, right? You find the misspelled word, you change it, and you're good to go. That's the search and find. It is very similar to what microarray does. Microarray has a predetermined misspelled, right, gene combination or mutation. It searches the individual's genome, or not genome, but gene, because it's looking specifically in gene by gene basis, I believe. And if it doesn't find that particular misspelled mutation, right, it sort of gives a negative. And that's it. Genetic testing on the clinical side uses a very different type of technology called next-gen sequencing. Next-gen sequencing is a literal reading of every single letter of the genetic alphabet, or at least the gene alphabet. That is comparable to me handing you a document or a book and saying, Doc, read me this document, but don't read me every word. Read me every letter of every word in every sentence of every paragraph on every page. It is that thorough. And not only are you going to read it once or twice or 3 times, you're going to read it 30 times, sometimes 80 times, sometimes 120 times. And so the level of certainty and accuracy that goes into next-gen sequencing, which is what is used for clinical genetic testing, right, is far greater than the depth and the DC in most cases of microarray. The reason why microarray is used is because it's effective. It can help find a very specific targeted mutation, right, that we're looking for. But it's also affordable. It's pretty cheap, right? Which is why you can get a direct-to-consumer genetic test that reviews your genes for $70, maybe even less than that, right? And it's fast. It's really quick. You can turn these tests around very quickly. So that's typically why a lot of direct-to-consumer companies are opting to use this particular type of technology. It's actually surprising, even to the scientific community, how poorly accurate those tests were in that particular study, because microarray typically is not that inaccurate. Microarray is still a relatively reliable technology. So it's even surprising to the scientific community why the results were so shockingly horrible, right, in that particular study. But again, if you were to go into a side-by-side comparison of microarray tech versus next-gen sequencing tech, right, it's a drastically different technology when it comes to accuracy and how thorough these technologies are. We are a direct-to-consumer company that uses clinical genetic testing and next-gen sequencing and CLIA CAP-certified labs. We don't work with laboratories that don't have these designations, basically. CAP and CLIA labs are the labs that your doctor uses, the labs that hospitals use, the labs that insurance companies pay. And it's because they operate at very high standards. They get audited left and right. They have to keep these certifications in these designations active in order to sort of offer really reliable testing to health systems and to doctors. And those are the only labs we work with because they use technologies like next-gen sequencing. And so the moral of the story is not all genetic tests are created equal, and not all genetic technologies are created equal. And that is why, as a physician or as a medical provider, you have to be very aware of the types of technologies and the types of genetic tests that are being sold and being offered, so that you can be very discriminatory when it comes to using these types of tests for the betterment and for the care of your patients.
Mm. So can you give me a list of terms or phrases that clinicians or healthcare consumers should look for to say, yes, this qualifies as validated good technology versus this is the one to stay away from? Because you mentioned microarray. I know on your website you talk about whole exome sequencing, and we might want to define exome because it's all technical language.
It is.
Yeah, and so maybe it. And again, if this is outside your realm of expertise, that's fine. But trying to define the difference between whole exome sequencing, genotyping, or genotype sequencing, because that's not my field of expertise. These are questions that I have as well.
Sure. So I think every provider should ask a couple questions when they're looking for a particular type of test or a particular laboratory. Number one, what technology are you using? Is this microarray? And if it is microarray, what genes are you looking at? What particular mutations are you looking for? Because that's what microarray does, right? It has a preset mutation that it's kind of flashing a light on the gene for it's looking for. So what are you looking for? And is this laboratory a CAP or CLIA certified laboratory? Or is it just, a startup laboratory that somebody just decided to wake up, buy some expensive machinery and start running, right? Which is perfectly legal. Anybody can do that. You can literally buy, a couple $1 million worth of machinery, maybe even less, open up a lab and sell testing to the public. That's perfectly normal, perfectly legal. But the key here is that you're probably not running it the way that a CAP and CLIA certified laboratories run. You probably don't have expert geneticists and laboratory directors that are sort of managing this particular laboratory. Those things make it different. What bioinformatics technology are you using to analyze the data? So all of these questions are really important to ask. And once a provider has a better sense of how this laboratory is run, what tech they're using, are they CAP CLIA certified, what types of tests are they offering, is there a geneticist on staff that they could speak to? Once all of those questions are answered, do they offer genetic counseling, right? That's very unlikely to be a thing. But that's a good question to ask. Can an expert genetic counselor guide my patient on what these results mean? Are you focusing on health specific genes, or are these just fun to know genes? Like, I think 23andMe offers a test that uncovers if you have a genetic aversion to cilantro or something like that.
Yes,
right? Like,
exactly.
this is it's cool, it's fun, but like, is it going to change my life? No,
Yeah,
it's not.
It's
right?
not practical.
Right. So these are things that I think like I said, every clinician, every clinical provider needs to be able to ask.
So, well, I had a question pop up that it relates to a topic we've already talked about, which is the genetic counselors. And I know that they're not employees of Panacea. They're, a service, I would assume, that subcontracts
Correct.
with you. But
Partners,
would you
yes.
say it's fair to say that their first goal is to help people not freak out when they realize they have genes that predispose them to, things that can be quite scary, cancers and heart disease and stroke?
Yeah, absolutely. So believe it or not, one of our jobs, before a patient even gets a test, before they even sit down with a genetic counselor, is to help the people that are considering this type of test not freak out. That's literally our job, because we cannot do what we do. We cannot sell genetic testing and make this stuff more accessible without educating the user properly and giving them the comfort of understanding that this test is not your destiny. The results of this test are not meant to scare you. If this was a scary test, we wouldn't exist, literally.
Yeah.
Like, what company would be in business if the product that they were offering was really scary? Like, there's no purpose, right? So these tests are literally available so that you can take away something vital away, when you get your results. And that is one of two things. It's either a little bit more relief because you don't have a genetic mutation that puts you more at risk for something, which, by the way, most people actually will fall into that box.
Yeah.
Most people do not have clinical mutations that will increase their risk for developing certain problems. So that's a great thing, right? You walk away with a little bit more comfort. The second thing that you can walk away from is empowerment. You know now that you have a mildly elevated risk or a majorly elevated risk for this particular problem. And here's the good news. You can now, today, before you have any problems, take action to reduce the likelihood of you getting this problem. And in some cases, completely eliminate it. It depends on, obviously, what the problem is. And so, again, the purpose of these tests is to put you in a better place with the results than without them. That is the sole reason we have a company, because this is beneficial and this is helpful. It is not supposed to be scary, and it is not supposed to be something that people are like, oh, I don't want to do this. Otherwise, it wouldn't be beneficial. It wouldn't work. Yeah.
And it's probably important to point out, too, that with all of the sequences that you guys can identify accurately and with confidence, not all of them carry an increased risk level like the 80% of the BRCA gene that you used as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Some gene variants will predispose someone to a particular condition by a factor of 10%.
Exactly.
Others might be 30%. So it's a range. Just because you have a gene, the question then is, what is the gene and what is the risk associated with that specific gene?
Precisely.
Which then also kind of gives you the likelihood that taking ownership of your health and taking action on that is going to help. For example, if you have a gene variant that is only, contributes 10% to the risk and then 90% is epigenetic, that means that finding the right diet and lifestyle, maybe getting on the right nutritional supplements, is going to have way more impact on your outcome than the genetic risk might imply for the gene itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would imagine that these genetic counselors not only help people not freak out, but realize they're in control and now they can take action, but then to start sorting through their gene variant profile and showing these are your really high risk ones, these are your lower risk ones. And so to help them understand the genetic landscape, or let's say the risk landscape that their gene testing presents to them. So I have another question just based on the last couple of minutes of conversation, is that when I look on your website, and I understand sometimes things that we post on websites don't capture the entirety of what might be looked at, but you have one graphic on the website that kind of breaks down, I think it's roughly about 10 different condition types or gene variants, most of which I think fall into the categories of various cancers and cardiovascular disease risk or risk for cardiovascular events. Is that the totality of where your focus is right now? And if so, is that because of the limitation in the testing, or is that simply because statistically most people are going to die from cancer or heart disease?
Excellent question. So before I answer that, let me sort of highlight what type of testing we do so that I can sort of answer the question that you just posed. So we focus on a type of genetic test called whole exome sequencing. There are two like big daddy, granddaddy genetic tests that are available in clinical genetic testing. There's whole genome sequencing and whole exome sequencing. Whole genome sequencing is pretty much what it sounds like. It is the review of every tidbit of genetic information that lives in your genome, everything from like the A to Z. So if I was to compare it to something we use and know every day, it is the first letter of the title of a book on the cover of the book until the very last letter on the back cover of the book. Mm-hmm. That's the whole genome. The whole exome is pretty similar, but it is more focused. And what it focuses on are the genes, just the genes. Now, that might pose another question. So people say, wait a minute, isn't your genome your genes? And the answer is yes, but there's more than just your genes in your genome. Your genes are really specific packets, little purses of information that instruct your body to do something. But there is genetic data outside of those purses, outside of those little, information pockets. There's information in between, like I said, and those areas essentially of the genome don't necessarily instruct your body to do something specific. They don't actually code for proteins, and therefore they don't actually give information to your body. But what they do, and frankly, we're still kind of understanding what they do. What they do is they support the gene areas. They're kind of like supportive genetic information that help the genes do what they need to do. So the important thing to understand is that the gene areas, the areas that carry information that code, your body to do something specific, those areas, as far as we understand today, are the areas in which, if there is a mutation in your gene, that can affect your disease susceptibility. So most of the genetic changes that occur in our genome that affect our health come from changes in the genes, in the gene packets, not in the areas in between, right? Makes sense because those gene areas are instructing our body to do something, and the areas of genetic information in between the genes aren't really coding, right? Or giving information to our bodies to do something. So the exome is sequencing only the gene areas, right? The packets of information that give our body instruction. That is what the exome covers. The reason why that is so important is because, again, not only is it the areas that are actually giving instruction to our body, when you sequence those areas, you actually are running a test that is much more cost effective. Mm-hmm. Whole exome sequencing is actually a fraction of the cost of whole genome sequencing. And it gives you almost all the information that you need when it comes to understanding how your genetics are impacting your health. So it's the biggest bang for your buck, the most juice right for the squeeze. So that's important to understand. Whole exome sequencing versus whole genome sequencing, and then whole exome sequencing versus something like microarray. Microarray is, again, little search and find of a predetermined mutation. Whole exome is a reading, a literal reading. It uses next-gen sequencing technology. So another example of what whole exome sequencing would look like, it would be, again, me handing you a book and me saying, okay, doc, read me the first letter of the first word in chapter 1 to the last letter of the last word in chapter 30, whatever is the last chapter, right? It's all the meat and potatoes of the book. It doesn't read the cover. It doesn't read the acknowledgments. It doesn't read the table of contents, right? That would be whole genome. But whole exome reads me the story. It tells me everything I need to know about the story of this book. And again, it's a fraction of the cost. So that's why we choose whole exome. I know that was a little bit of a exhaustive explanation, but it's very important for people to understand.
Well, but this is the kind of information I want, particularly for clinicians who might be listening. And so if you'll indulge me for a second, I'll try to get some terminology out, and then I have a question about the work that you're doing. I'll come back to that. So basically, I think if I understood you correctly, merging that with what I think I already understand, which I granted could be completely imperfect. We look at DNA and we use words like DNA and genetics and genome almost interchangeably. They're obviously related, but they're not necessarily the same thing. I know that in years gone by, scientists were using terms like junk DNA. And my understanding is that is referring, or used to refer to, the non-coding parts of the DNA sequences and the chromosomes. Another term for that are introns, right? So you have exons and introns. The exons, all of the exons grouped together make up your exome, and that's what you're testing is the coding. And what we mean by coding DNA, as you pointed out, is that it gives instructions to a cell to do something by encoding or driving the production of proteins, right? And so the introns, or quote unquote the junk DNA, they may code for certain things, but it doesn't necessarily have a function associated with it. So what you said is it plays somewhat of a like a supporting role. My understanding, and again, this is where my understanding starts to break down, is that scientists are now starting to think, well, maybe all junk DNA is not junk after all.
It's not junk, right?
That there are functions that these things might serve. We just don't know what they are. So here's my question to you guys with your whole exome sequencing. Are you sampling and retaining data on exomes that don't relate to things like cancers and heart disease? Because it's part of the exome. It's just not what you're reporting on or what your focus is. So are you growing a database that can later be used to go through to find patterns or correlations that maybe in 2 years or 5 years, we're going to say, guess what? We found other stuff that is relevant for this problem over here. So that's one question. And knowing that we're starting to think that junk DNA is not all junk, are you gathering data on junk DNA sequences again, so that at some point in the future, somebody smarter than us can come along and say, guess what? This isn't junk and here's why, and here's how we can use it.
Yeah. So in order for us to gather information on the junk DNA, as you put it, and as science puts it, right? The scientists have been referring to those intronic regions, just as you said, for ever since we started studying genetics as junk DNA.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about junk DNA is that it is actually the vast majority of the genome.
Yes.
The exome itself is a very small portion of the genome.
Yes.
And so it's highly unlikely that this junk DNA is actually junk. I think that the key here is just that we don't fully understand what it's doing. We don't know. Right? Yeah. We don't fully have a grasp on what this stuff is doing and how it's behaving. And so you pose a good question: is are we actually looking at at that junk DNA. The only way we can do that is if we actually sequence the whole genome. Today, we truly only sequence the exome. Our laboratory partners really just strictly look at the exome. And that data, of course, sits in a secure database. And our goal, of course, in the future is to sort of start tinkering with that data, grouping it together and taking a look at what patterns we might be able to find. Today, that is not something we are doing, full transparency, but the data is there. And we intend to never utilize this data without the permission and the control, essentially, of the user.
Yeah.
It is a founding principle of ours at Panacea, where this data is not our data. Your data is your data, my data is my data, right? And so I should get to choose, and I should get to see how my data is being utilized. And so we will never analyze data or use data or share data with anybody outside of Panacea without the knowledge, awareness, and permission of the user. So that's something we want to make very clear. But today, we are actually not utilizing that data per se, right? We're sort of just housing it. And of course, in the future, I think greater use of it in the exact way that you proposed, which is identifying these patterns and linking them to perhaps new insights is going to be important. But again, today we only look at the exome.
Yeah, and let me talk about the data privacy, and I might reserve the right to come back to the exome and the and the technology in a little bit. But so I know that like when 23andMe first came out, and I think I might be wrong, but I think they were the first direct-to-consumer company, at least the first one that I was aware of, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, and there was a lot of people throwing their hands up saying like, whoa, Nelly, let's slow down on this. What's going to happen if an insurance company gets my genetic information and denies me coverage, or whatever the case might be? So in that sense, is it more advisable to source genetic testing through a company like Panacea rather than going to your primary doctor, your internist, and trying to arrange it and have insurance cover it? Because going through a third party like you keeps things like I have control of this. And the only way my doctor or an insurance company is going to know about it is if I allow them to see it. Is that in your mind, is that a reason why people should consider using Panacea rather than trying to convince their doctor, who honestly probably doesn't understand this stuff anyways?
Yeah.
And I hate to cast shade on practitioners, but yeah, I would say that most docs don't know what to do with this data anyways.
Sure.
So yeah, I'll just kind of toss that back over to you. So
there's one very important thing to know when it comes to data privacy and data security. To be fair, whether it's 23andMe or whether you go through a clinical laboratory or a company like Panacea, there is a federal law called GINA, and GINA stands for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And what this law does is it basically protects people like me and you who want to get genetic testing, but also don't want our insurance companies to discriminate against us because we have an increased risk for developing cancer or whatever, cardiovascular disease. So that law essentially says, ensure you cannot discriminate or increase, the premiums or deny coverage for a patient because of their genetic makeup. It is illegal for an insurance company to do that. So that's protective for us. Basically, we can get this test and we can feel comfortable knowing that no matter what our results are, our insurance cannot hike up our premiums or deny us coverage. But to your point, if there's somebody who wants to get this test but still doesn't feel comfortable, right? Despite the laws that might be able to protect them, they can go outside of the traditional healthcare system use a company like Panacea, because of course we are offering clinical genetic testing through CAP certified labs, and they can get this test and they can receive this information without being required to share it because it was not funded by insurance dollars. If your insurance company funds a test for you, your lab tests, your MRIs, your whatever, they are entitled by law to see those results because they paid for it, right?
Right.
If they do not pay for it, if you paid for it out of pocket through a company like ours, then yeah, legally they are not entitled to take a look at the results because they didn't pay for it. You did.
And they can't compel you to share that.
I don't believe so. No.
Yeah.
And so if you want to be extra cautious about your results being protected, again, despite the fact that there are laws to protect it, then it would be a great idea to use a company like Panacea.
Yeah.
And again, a company that uses CAP and CLIA certified laboratories, a company that has the clinical guides that are experts on this stuff. It's certainly, I'm biased, obviously, but I think this would be certainly a great solution for people who are interested in accessing this type of information securely.
Yeah. So let's go back to the things that you guys do test for, because I posed a question. I think we got sidetracked and I didn't get the answer. At least I didn't hear it. Talking about the menu of things that you test for, is it limited to those things because that's what the technology allows, because that's where we have our highest degree of certainty, or is it simply because the number one, number two killers are heart disease, cancer?
Yeah, it's the former. So genetic testing, even the most comprehensive genetic testing, whole exome, whole genome, what have you, is basically as advanced as our scientific knowledge of genetics. So it's limited by what we know and what we understand. The thing that I think is important to note is, although when it comes to whole exome sequencing and whole genome sequencing, everything is being looked at. You're not cherry picking genes. You're not only looking at certain sections of genes. Everything is being looked at. The information that is yielded off of these tests, again, is limited to where we understand genes the most. But the interesting thing is, because everything is being sequenced and everything is being looked at, your raw data is actually quite important. And the raw data is basically what I said was all the information that comes off the machines, whether science understands it or not. Everything that was sequenced. Your raw data is very important because your raw data doesn't change. These are the genes that you inherited from mom and dad.
Right.
They're not changing over your lifetime. But what is changing is, again, our scientific knowledge of what these genes mean. And so when you get a test with Panacea, we share, upon request, your whole exome data. It's a pretty large file, it's about 7 or 8 gigabytes, and you get to keep that. And you, for the rest of your life, can take your raw data and compare it to the latest scientific studies and the latest scientific knowledge. And as time goes on, if there are any relevant discoveries to your particular genetic makeup, you will be the first to know because you have your raw data. You only need to get exome sequencing or genome sequencing once in your life.
Once.
And you always have the raw data, and you can always use that raw data to kind of compare it to, again, the latest scientific knowledge. And there are so many databases that you can upload your data to, and they will essentially give you updated reports on all the latest knowledge and scientific understanding of genes that might pertain to you, right? So that's really, really important when it comes to whole exome and whole genome sequencing, is how valuable your raw data is to you for the rest of your life.
I mean, I like that. I'm glad you pointed that out. So, going back to one of the conclusions on that 2018 paper in Nature, saying that publicly available databases were incomplete and in some cases, frankly, incorrect. Do you have a couple of different third-party platforms that serve this purpose that you'd feel comfortable saying, yeah, we think this group or these groups are doing the best job. And if you're going to take your 7 gigabyte file and upload it somewhere to have it housed and be continually updated, who would that be if you're willing to share?
Sure. So we are not affiliated with this company that I'm going to share. We do not endorse them or in any way, but we have essentially we have patients that have used this particular database and providers that also like to use this database when it comes to raw data. It's called Promethease, and it's spelled, I think, Promethease. So a play on, Prometheus. But that particular database, I wouldn't say it's public. It is a private company, I believe.
Well, I mean, publicly available in the sense that I could get my own file.
Yes,
upload it.
You can literally go to Prometheus.com right now and take a look at what it looks like. You can upload your data there, whether it's your whole exome data or whole genome data from companies like ours, or even your 23andMe data or your direct-to-consumer data, which you can request your raw data from them. By the way, it's going to be much smaller than, of course, what we offer, because again, they're looking at very specific small things.
Right.
But you can upload your data there for a very small fee, and you'll produce a report, and you can do that once a year and sort of keep track of any of these changes that might be pertinent to you. So that's a reliable database from what we understand. Again, we're not affiliated with them.
Right. Understood. Are you guys at the forefront of gene testing technology, or is that really just a matter of there are several competing technologies that are considered cutting edge? We just choose this one, whole exome sequencing, because that, in our view and based on our guiding principles, is the most relevant way to test.
Yeah. So to be fair, our laboratories are the ones that are using the most cutting edge technologies, right?
Yeah,
we select,
yes.
right? We select partners, laboratory partners and physicians and genetic counselors who are, at the top of their field. They know exactly what they're doing. They have a tremendous amount of experience and excellent leadership when it comes to these spaces. And so we partner with these experts. When it comes to, again, clinical genetic testing, right now, the gold standard is next-gen sequencing. And that is offered, obviously. Sorry.
That's okay.
That is offered by, of course, the machinery that is used, right? And the machinery, one of the leading companies in this type of machinery is a company called Illumina. Illumina is like, the Apple of genetic sequencing machinery. Mm. And so laboratories that we select obviously typically use Illumina machinery, and they use, top-notch bioinformatics systems, and they have, trained geneticists and all kinds of experts at their laboratories. So we like to believe that we partner with people who are really, leading the genetic space in those ways. We choose, again, to use whole exome for the purposes that I explained. It is the most thorough. It is a test that you only need once in your life. And it is one of the most affordable tests to do, right? So our next step potentially is whole genome, when whole genome becomes a little bit more affordable. But beyond that, when it comes to genetic sequencing and the review of your inherited genes or inherited risks, as of today, those are it: whole genome and whole exome. And so, as long as those kind of remain the top tiers of clinical genetic tests, those are the tests we're going to do. And as soon as there's something new, we'll be the first to do it.
Yeah,
as well.
and I was going to ask if you maintain an active list of conditions or gene/condition pairs that are most likely to be included if you start to expand your test menu?
Yeah. So again, that would be something that our laboratories would do.
Yeah.
Our laboratories are that is their job, essentially, to understand where these genetic changes might be contributing to particular diseases. They they have access to incredible databases,
Yeah.
and they have the expertise, of course, on staff, the geneticists on staff that whose entire careers and entire jobs focus on keeping track of all of the latest developments when it comes to these things.
So in your ecosystem of, all the experts that you've pulled together that serve under Panacea, who actually generates a report that a consumer could use and understand? Or
Yeah.
do they get something that's, just all the sequence codes or the R reference number, that alphanumeric, everything begins with an R, to the point where, like, okay, this makes no sense to me. I either must upload it to something like Prometheus, or I need to schedule a call with my genetic counselor. Are your consumers, are they given something that they could understand?
Yeah. So the laboratories that we utilize produce clinical reports for us. So they, of course, sequence the patient sample. They run it through their machinery, and then they use bioinformatics software to kind of analyze what these results mean. And then they produce a clinical report for us. The clinical report gets shared with the patient, and of course, it gets shared with the genetic counselor. The clinical report is readable, certainly, and it has a summary of the results. You have a mutation in this gene, this gene, this gene, but it's dense, right? It's not necessarily incredibly user-friendly. But that's okay, because again, the patient gets that and the genetic counselor gets that. When the genetic counselor receives the report, what they do is they create a summary based on the report and based on their own. Every patient will get a results report, right? A clinical report, as well as a summary. So once they meet with the genetic counselor will translate what that report means and recap the conversation and sort of also clarify what the next steps are. And every patient will get those two things, the results and the summary from the genetic counselor. So no one walks away from Panacea confused. No one walks away not understanding what their results are or what they should be doing next. Everybody really gets that clinical guidance that we really wanted to be able to offer to people.
Yeah. And, honestly, I like how you set that up, because the more complicated the clinical data is, the more need there is to have a conversation with an expert who can translate that. Now we're living in an era now where so much information is available literally at your fingertips. It's easy for people to take clinical data absent of any context or nuance and come to the wrong conclusions. Precisely.
Yeah. That's I think a key problem, is that accessibility to data, as you said, is ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. Anybody can access these types of technologies and can get their hands on this information. But the problem is this information isn't always very easy to understand.
Right.
And again, a key part is understanding what your results mean and what they don't mean. That is so important, because you can get a genetic test and realize you have a mutation in this gene, and do a quick Google search and find out that this gene might increase your risk for all of these horrible things. But without the nuanced guidance of an expert like a clinical genetic counselor, you won't really know where you sit. You won't really know where your true risks are, and what these results really mean for you. And the other thing that's also very important is your own personal history of disease, if any, or your family history of disease, if you have a family history of disease. And so genetic counselor can also take these really important ancillary bits of information and also use that to sort of interpret what your genetic results might be. And that's key. That's something that you can't get from, an average direct-to-consumer test. Forget about the technology, right? You're not even getting the real thorough next-gen sequencing technology from most direct-to-consumer companies. You're certainly not getting the interpretation of the expert, or able to talk to somebody about what grandpa had, or what your aunt had, or what you may have had personally. Those are all very important things in assessing an individual's overall risk, including their genetic makeup.
Yeah. This might be a question for either the labs doing the testing or maybe your chief science officer. So if you don't have the answer, that's okay. But do you know what the false negative, false positive rate is for the whole exome sequencing versus the microarray?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the error rates when it comes to next-gen sequencing are very, very low. There is no perfect test, as you mentioned in the beginning, but we're talking about error rates less than 0.01%.
Yeah, which is negligible.
Really negligible, right? Really, really low. And part of the reason for that is the redundancy, right? Because these tests are not only run through these machines that produce these results. There's also other types of technologies that are sort of used to be for the information to be resequenced and relooked at. So there's multiple technologies that go into using this. But next-gen sequencing itself is very, very thorough. And remember, the amount of times that each letter of the genetic alphabet is read is not once or twice or three times. We're talking about 30 times, 90 times, 100 times sometimes, depending on the type of test that's being run. So it's repetitious, and it's because of that, it's thorough, and the error rates are super low. So it's, again, not perfect. There's nothing perfect, but certainly very low error rates, and the information typically is very reliable. Remember, again, CAP CLIA certified labs using next-gen sequencing technology. Yep. That's really what we have to focus on.
That's what we're looking for sure. All right, so let's try to clue this up a little bit. But what I would like you to end with is, well, first let's talk about your story, because I know that I read some of the articles that you sent me links to. So I'm always interested in people's individual stories. But once we do that, why don't you give your best pitch to a consumer, a healthcare consumer, about why they should think about Panacea, and then let's switch gears and pitch the practitioners and say, why should you be doing this or encouraging your patients to do this? So let's go back up and let's talk about your story and your own experience with Panacea.
Okay, sure. So we'll start there. So the weirdest part is, I think if you would have asked me 10 years ago, what I'd be doing today, the last thing I would have told you is being the founder of a healthcare company. It was so, off my radar and not part of my plan. I actually wanted to be a doctor. I was on my way to medical school. I had just graduated from the University of Miami, and I was applying to medical school and a bunch of different medical schools. And I got a very obscure opportunity to work for a small group of genetic laboratories. And my job at those genetic laboratories was to sell genetic testing to doctors. And it seemed like a no-brainer opportunity. Of course, I could sell genetic testing to doctors. I want to be a doctor. Genetics is a huge part of my education. I can speak to it very well. There's no better person to sell genetic testing to doctors than me. Well, I ended up working part-time for those laboratories. And after about 90 days, after about 3 months, I made $0 because my whole job was commission-based. I couldn't sell one genetic test. And I didn't meet with one doctor or two doctors. We're talking about tens and tens of doctors. And so I not only realized I'm probably not a great salesperson, but I think that the bigger problem is that there's a massive, massive disconnect in the genetic space in healthcare. And that disconnect is really caused by two major things. This is what I kind of learned. Number one, insurance companies are doing a really poor job of providing wide coverage for genetic testing for people. very few people qualify for genetic testing. And studies are showing that those guidelines that basically screen those people in order to be qualified are missing more than 50% of people. So the guidelines that insurance companies follow to offer coverage to people are missing 50% of people. So huge barrier, insurance companies. Because of the insurance company lack of coverage, doctors, all the doctors that I met and tried to sell genetic testing to, were a lot more hesitant to utilize genetic testing in the care of their patients because they knew the struggle that the patients were going to have in dealing with their insurance companies. In addition, doctor awareness on how to use genetics in the care of their patients is still quite minimal because this stuff is advanced and it's changing and it's an ever moving target. And so doctors struggle to sort of keep up with it. So I had an aha moment really when I discovered those things and I realized, okay, so it's not the fact that the technology's not there. Technology's there. It's available. This is life-saving stuff and we can use it. It's just that the barriers that exist in the system, the insurance company lack of coverage, the lack of doctor awareness are literally inhibiting the access to this brilliant life-saving technology. And so it was in that moment that I said to myself, I'm going to be the one to change this. And I sort of embarked on this multi-year mission to learn as much about the space as I could to kind of unravel these problems that I just started to learn about. And it has been almost a decade of me on this path. And I met some incredible people who are 10 times smarter than I am and have much more experience in this space than I am. And we sort of created this solution to sort of, deliver these life-saving clinical tests directly to the public, the way that a lot of these direct-to-consumer companies are easily delivering some sort of genetic testing to the public, except we're going to bring the real thing to the public with that clinical guidance. When I launched the company to the public a couple years back, I decided I have to get this test done myself. Obviously, who would I be if I, was the founder of a genetic testing company and didn't get this test done myself? And lo and behold, I got this test and I realized that someone who would never qualify for genetic testing in today's healthcare, because I don't have a personal history of disease, I don't have a family history of disease, I have a genetic mutation that makes me 9 times more likely to develop ovarian cancer than the average woman. And my sister, of course, got this test because of my results as well. She has the same exact mutation too. And so in a very weird twist of events, the company that I founded to save millions of lives and get this test in the hands of more people ultimately maybe saved my life and my sister's life. So it just goes to show you how unaware, even me as the founder, how unaware I was of how much I needed this test, and how unaware the vast majority of people are that they probably could benefit greatly from this type of test and save their own lives and get in control of their health. And so it really validated my mission. In founding this company, I realized that I was one of the people that really could benefit from this. No,
that's a great story. At what age would you suggest people consider doing this test on themselves? I mean, obviously sooner rather than later, but
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So that you hit the nail on the head. The key here is to do this test when you don't need it, right?
Yeah.
You don't when you're not sick, when you're not, hitting that age where things start to rear their ugly heads, right? You want to get this test when you're healthy. And for some people, that be as early as mid-30s. Certainly early 40s is a perfect time in which you should get this test. And, most people that get these types of tests are healthy in all sense of the word. They're active, they exercise, they're, they eat well, they do a lot of things to lower their stress, they sleep well. Most people that get this type of test are the healthiest.
Right.
And the reason why, they're getting this type of test is because they understand the value of prevention, of taking action before there is a problem.
Yeah.
And so if I was to answer your other questions, to kind of deliver a pitch to the audience listening, that would really be it. If you are the type of person who believes that more information is better, and you are already doing everything in your power to be the healthiest version of you, this is a test that you should add to your tool shed, essentially. It is not the end-all be-all test. There is no end-all be-all test. But there are really powerful tools that should be in your tool shed for your healthcare and for your longevity. And this is certainly one of them. And it's a once in a lifetime. You don't need to repeat whole exome sequencing again. You'll have your raw data, and you'll continually be able to keep this test and these results valuable because you'll have the opportunity to kind of reference all the latest discoveries to your data. So it's a no-brainer. This information is going to help you. It's going to empower you. Or at the very least, this test is going to give you a little bit more comfort because you may not have any genetic mutations that need to be paid attention to. So again, to me, it's a no-brainer, and it potentially saved my life. So
yeah. And, if we look at the menu of things that you test for, I like what you're focusing on. And just to reiterate this for people who are listening, the number one and number two killers, what most, if not all of us, are going to succumb to, it's either going to be some form of heart disease, which is number one, followed by, various forms of more common cancers. And those two combined far outpace all other causes of death. Right. So I like the fact that you're kind of hedging your bets by focusing on where the numbers and where the probabilities lie. So final question then, just talk to practitioners and give your best pitch as to why they should consider Panacea as part of their diagnostic workup. And, but the kind of work that we do, which is quite often reactionary in the sense of sometimes people don't come to us until they've been sick for a very long time.
Sure.
But I will say, at least for myself, and I know for other colleagues of mine, we're seeing a lot more people in the last 5 years coming to us saying, I really don't have any issues. I just I'm healthy and I want to stay that way. So they're adopting this preventive mindset. And it seems to me that something like Panacea as a service fits right into that model.
Absolutely. Yeah. So listen, the pitch is very similar, right? Again, there are a handful of very powerful tools that exist today and that are available today to us. Not all of them are accessible. Panacea is changing the game when it comes to making one of these very powerful tools far more accessible and useful to people. Of course, again, that's whole exome sequencing and this deep kind of clinical genomic testing. Providers, I hear it all the time from physicians. Oh, my patient brought me their direct-to-consumer test. It basically delivered zero information to me. It was almost useless. But everybody's hell-bent on this genetic testing, and I just don't know what to do with it, right? It's almost useless. We are the answer to that. We are the anecdote, essentially, right? To this issue. We are actually bringing the types of testing that doctors should be ordering, that insurance companies should be covering for people. And we're bringing that with guidance. You are not going to be left alone as the provider. We have the clinical expertise that can not only guide the patient, but also can answer your questions as the provider. Our genetic counseling partners consult with the physicians if there are any questions. And so we are your partner when it comes to clinical genetic testing and preventative genetic testing for your patients. You can certainly rely on us because, again, we're bringing all of these key stakeholders together and we're making that far more accessible for your patients and also for you so that you can do what you do best, which is save lives and take care of people.
Very well said. Very well said. Any final words for the audience?
Final words. Goodness. I think we covered a lot of this, to be honest with you. But again, I think that the key message here, and of course, it sounds like my dogs agree, is that the key message here is that these tests and these solutions exist to empower you. because in this day and age, everything is accessible, right?
Yeah.
But not everything that is accessible is going to be helpful.
Yes.
Not everything that is accessible is going to be accurate and reliable.
Yeah.
And we believe that if you're going to base your healthcare decisions on the information that comes off of these tests and services, they have to be reliable. And again, they exist to give you really great, solid information so that you and your doctors can make really informed decisions for yourself, and get in the driver's seat of your health, and sort of put yourself in the best position to live the healthiest, longest life.
Amen to that. And we'll call the interview concluded. Thank you, Dahlia Attia-King, for all of your insights into genetic testing, predictive genetic testing, and the value it brings to both clinicians and healthcare consumers. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive or adjunctive care.